Greetings and felicitations. Nice to have you out tonight. Our guest is Adam Drissel from North Carolina. Adam is a teacher of Torah and author of 2 books now, at least, that I know of. I was introduced to Adam by my stepdaughter, Marcille, who was attending his Yahad there near Raleigh, North Carolina. And Adam and I had a number of very good chats, and we got together on the Yahad think tank. He's a charter member, actually, of the Vero Yahad think tank. And I finally got a chance to go up and meet him a few years ago and to enjoy his teaching and his group. I've been there a few times since. So we've become good friends and helpers to each other. Whenever I have a language question, he's the one I go to, and about half the time he writes me back, "What do you want now?" Yeah, something like that. Anyway, we had a debate, a friendly debate in 2014 that I think we used Uvu for that. Maybe some people here was on that. We were debating whether the mystery of Revelation was history or not, or whether there was a futurist perspective to be looked at there. And there was so much confusion during the chat because of all the bells and whistles of Uvu and people getting on and off. It's impossible to shut down the noise. That I went back and looked at that video now after 3-4 years, and it was just crazy. It was crazy. We both made some good points, but now we're going to get a chance to hear Adam as he has gone from a futurist perspective to a mystery is history perspective in these years. And I'm sure that was a great struggle. Why don't you tell us about that, Adam, and a little about your book?
Sure. So, well, as Jackson so rightly said, the desire to kind of do more study on this was spurned in large part from the conversation that we had, discussions that I have overheard, and in our own fellowship, there were little snippets here and there that we had brought up the book of Revelation and various pieces of history that kind of whet my appetite, per se, to find out whether there was more behind all of this than what we had all been taught. And of course, I'm not one to shy away from a controversial scriptural debate by any means. After I broke free myself from the Christian church, everything seemed a lot more easier to challenge at that point. So nothing became territory that was too difficult to tread. So in this particular instance, we had in our fellowship, whenever we don't have a topic to discuss in our second half of our sessions, we usually like to study a topic or a New Testament book or something like that. But we always allow open sessions to discuss whatever topics may be on our hearts. And sometimes we'll write them down and we'll throw them into a hat and we'll pull one out. And we kind of let Yahweh do the deciding through the lot in that sense as to what he wants us each to study and to bring to us. So it was, a few months ago at this point that Jackson's stepdaughter, Marcille, put something in there with select verses from the book of Revelation. And that particular session that we had, that particular service, we went through several different tiny little snippets of things that really just made me see that there was more to this whole story than what I had initially suspected, and that there could be a lot more answers there than there were questions. But I had to dig into it myself. So at the end of that, I resolved to go back to my house, and I had a copy of Josephus's Wars of the Jews there, and I had to sit down and say, I'm not going to be able to evaluate, debunk, change my view on this or whatever it may be until I've given it a full read. So welcome to where we are today.
Yeah, Adam is a sleuth. There's a Bible mystery, I think I put in the foreword, that he is like a terrier on rats. Somebody told me the other day that the terrier was bred specifically for chasing down small varmints. Well, that's the same way with Adam. I certainly wouldn't want to get in a debate with him now, because there's no chance that I would get out of it. He is a sleuth on Bible mysteries and the languages as well. He's just come so far since I've known him, and I'm really proud of him, especially with this new book. It is a wonderful book. I have an e-copy of it, and I got to read as far as I could go on it. I really like the fact that in the introduction, he has numerous hints, we might say, numerous hints to the fact that he's going to historical records for the fulfillment of Revelation rather than the speculation of so many, especially these latter-day prophets. And another thing I noticed in it I really liked was using just enough quotations from Josephus to make his point and matching them up with Revelation as a commentary to interpret the Revelation in the light of Josephus' history of the Jewish war, that it's extremely convincing as well. So what about that introduction that's about 50 pages long, Adam? Pretty much what are you saying there?
Yeah, so I have a book right here, and I'm going to look through some of it. But there's several things that should be pointed out. Let me know if you can't hear me good enough, because I had to drop my mic to turn this page. But
you're good.
So one of the things I think that's really important about this book that's different than any that I've even seen, and I know this because in doing this book and the studies for it, I actually had to reference several other different people's commentaries on it as well to see what the views were that existed. None of them I've seen has been taken from a pro-Torah, pro-Hebraic, anti-dispensationalist view where the Torah is not abrogated as a result of the destruction of the temple and Jerusalem and the Jewish Commonwealth. I actually have a full appendix in the book devoted to the fact that the continuance of the pure and unadulterated faith, those are the words of the historians, not myself, was perpetuated after the destruction of Jerusalem in the city of Pella, and that it actually spread back into Jerusalem all the way through the third generation of disciples after the apostles were still working miracles at that time in the faith. And it wasn't until after the last Hebrew bishop of Jerusalem was gone that the corruptions in the faith started entering in. So that's all very important information, and the Torah is tied throughout this whole thing because, after all, it is a Hebraic book, and it was most likely written to Hebrew believers in Asia that would have only been really the only ones that would have understood the symbols that are found therein. So within the introduction, I go through several very important foundational points, such as time indicating statements that are most often overlooked, and this includes myself, such as the phrase "at hand," or "soon to come to pass," or "behold, I am coming quickly." You know, from a Christian perspective, from a futurist perspective, we have to spiritualize these terms in order to make them make any sense. Otherwise, we can't make it fit into our doctrine. And honestly, when you do that, in hindsight, looking back at it, if you pull those contemporary terms and phrases out of their historical context, then you also remove the relevance of that particular letter and the entire Revelation as a whole from its the people that lived in that day, which means you really question, well, why in the heck did you write it to begin with? Why address it to the 7 churches in Asia when you should have addressed it to people that didn't exist 2,000 years later? So the introduction goes into prepping that, giving the anti-dispensationalist view in general, going into the initial terms of time indicators. There's an important reference to a work that Sir Isaac Newton did in the 18th century, where he put together terms, scripturally based, obviously, because he was a scripturalist himself, that apocalyptic terminology must be understood to properly understand the apocalypse. And even prophetic literature such as Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel all speak using terminology that must be understood properly in a biblical context in order for the message to be understood. When the prophecy is given through Isaiah that says Yahweh's going to come and he's going to smite the oaks of Bashan and the cedars of Lebanon, we can't truly be think in our minds that his concern for vengeance for his people was to slash the trees down in another nation. These are all apocalyptic terms, and there's a table in the introduction that goes through those so that it helps the reader throughout the book to understand what those are. In addition, it whets the appetite of, is the kingdom of Elohim already present today, based on certain scriptures that we find. There's a little passage in there about that. What else is in the introduction? I give a brief, probably devote, I don't know, maybe 10 pages or so to external evidence to the early dating of the apocalypse versus the traditional date of 95 to 96 CE. The external evidence, believe it or not, is in great favor of the earlier dating, but I think that more so, even outside of that, whatever doubt there may lie in the early dating from the external evidence is resolved completely by the internal evidence. So then that's where it enters directly into the book at that point.
I think you mentioned the destruction of Jerusalem. First of all, I think your introduction could stand alone. Honestly, if we were going to use no evidence from historical sources, your way of putting first chapter of Revelation and the time phrases as well is extremely convincing, or at least it would be puzzling for the futurists to read that. They would have to go on, or they just have to give up. But most of the historical people that write it from a Josephus or historical or church traditional perspective, they consider the destruction of Jerusalem the end of Israel, when God moved the blessings from Israel onto the Christian church. That's preterism for you. That's one of the objections I have to it. You address this pretty strongly in your book, don't you?
Yeah. So Israel is promised to never go away. To say that it will in one way or another is to trash virtually all of the Old Testament prophets' writings in addition to what they carry through the New Testament. However, what's not typically referenced is the transference of Israel. Who is Israel? Who is true Israel? Was it ever intended to be something that was just limited to a certain people? Was it that's the whole dispensationalist thing about it, is that all the preterists, and I even hate using the phrase, futurist is the only proper phrase to describe that viewpoint, but I hate using the term preterist because of the same reason I hate using the term Christian for myself, is because of all the baggage that it comes across with. But the belief that, that Israel is destroyed and therefore gone is completely incorrect. The promise was that there would be a kingdom set up that was never to go away. The question isn't, is Israel destroyed or gone? The question is, where is Israel? Who is Israel? Who is Zion? And I think that the answers are throughout the New Testament and the teachings of Yeshua and the apostles, and especially in the book of Revelation. But they're masked and hidden from most people because they don't choose to look into it as deeply as they should. There's several illustrations when you actually read chapter 21, speaking of the New Jerusalem, in light of what we know in the New Testament and the teachings of Yeshua and in the book of Hebrews and so forth, that almost make it impossible if you did not see the identity of New Jerusalem after it's read in context.
Super. Let's see. I wanted to ask you about something you talked about just a little bit earlier, and that is the Pella Accident. Just to let the folks here know what I'm talking about, is that there was a warning that came to the people in and around Jerusalem, to believers, I should say, a prophetic warning that came from perhaps several different sources. So we read from the Olivet Discourse, from the church historians talk about it, and other ones that say when you see Jerusalem surrounded by army, flee. So our church tradition tells us that the Nazarenes that were in and around Jerusalem took that literally and did flee to a town on the border of Israel and Perea, I guess, in the not far from Damascus, right about exactly between Damascus and Jerusalem, called Pella, a Greek town, and a town that we read was actually where they destroyed the Jews in that town shortly before the war. Do you believe in the escape to Pella, first of all, and second of all, where do you think they might have lived? I'm asking you to speculate here a little bit in Pella if they did escape.
Well, so as you mentioned, Pella shortly, and this is all again in Josephus' writing, so none of this is coming from myself, but Pella was destroyed shortly after the rebellion against Cestius when he came through, because the Jews at that point started. They heard of the slaughters that were going on, and so everyone in the cities around them were like, wow, there's a rebellion against Rome brewing here. We don't want to show that we have any participation in this, so we're going to kill all the Jews that are around us. And so Pella was one of many suburb cities, per se, that was destroyed in this process. However, that destruction took place a good year and a half at the very least before the exile to Pella, at least according to the timeline as I understand it, took place. So there would have been time in that process to rebuild the houses and the primitive stuff that they had at that point. Where in Pella did they live? I don't honestly have a question to that. Or an answer to that question. I know that it was a Roman protected town in the sense that after it was conquered, garrisons remained there. Mm-hmm. And so I don't see the Hebrew believers that would have fled there as being those who made such a ruckus from a civil perspective that they would have caused a problem with the Roman people there. Hence, the Roman garrisons being positioned and stationed there provided them with not only a protection, because everyone knows the war is going on and they don't want to have anything to do with the Romans at that point, in addition to providing them with a place of haven and safety that's across the Jordan. That was not, nothing across the Jordan is really the goal of Vespasian or Titus in their campaigns. So it really worked out perfectly. And the tale, so to speak, if you want to call it a tale of how they got there and how the timeline worked out is actually pretty amazing from a historical perspective. And the book includes maps such as this. I don't know if you guys can even see this.
Yes, we can. Mm-hmm. Good.
This is just an example. As you can see, this is actually referring to the campaign of Vespasian as he started his Judean campaign. And if you kind of notice the line as he comes from Caesarea up there, the line trickles down and makes what appears to be in the shape of a river if it's looked at from the cities and where they were located anciently. Historically speaking, the flight of the woman and all of that took place as this dragon was spewing out this river to cut after the woman. And I'm just giving you guys a little preview here. But at the time that this happened, Vespasian's last stop before he was going to go into Jerusalem was Jericho. However, history tells us that when the Jerichites found out that Vespasian was coming, they all fled in great masses to the mountainous areas in such a degree that it actually stopped Vespasian's army from continuing to march. So Jericho was simultaneously emptied of all of its people at the same time. Jericho lies almost directly to the east after you cross over the Mount of Olives of Jerusalem. And the Mount of Olives and the trail through there has been used for the escape of kings like David and Ahab, I believe, was the other one in the past. And they went right across the Mount of Olives. So at this point, and there's very important aspects I go into from a linguistics perspective as well about how the verse which says you'll see Jerusalem encompassed by armies, it actually is in a participle tense where it says you'll see Jerusalem being encompassed by armies, which is important because most people think, oh, well, they're going to flee after the whole thing's surrounded. How's that going to be possible? Well, what they're seeing is the systematic dismantling of Judea around them and hearing about the burning of all the major towns and villages. And as soon as they see that opportunity's come and they're told to go, they flee to the east across the Mount of Olives as though it's split with a valley between, right through abandoned Jericho, across the Jordan, up the Jordan Valley, all safely as if carried on their own weight. So all this stuff is written in history. You just got to find it.
It's the same way with the latest on Pella as well. The mountains surrounding Pella found to be full of caves that, with artifacts dating back to that period. So we're looking at the mountains and the caves hiding people, not unlike it says in Revelation. Do you feel comfortable about identifying some of the symbols in the book?
Yes.
You do? Well, let's start with the biggie.
Okay.
That is the beasts of Revelation 13. Who do you think?
Well, so there's several pieces of information that go into that. The first beast is obviously the biggest one that's always discussed. It's 7 heads, 10 horns. It talks about one of the heads having fallen, right? Mm-hmm. You look at the first 7 emperors of Rome, and some question whether Julius was actually considered a Caesar, because Augustus is often considered the first Kaiser. Right. However, there are historians such as Tacitus and Suetonius who actually specifically call Julius the first Caesar, and Josephus actually does as well, though he doesn't mention Julius's name specifically. He calls Augustus the second and Gaius the third, and he names all these other ordinal numbers there. So the 7 heads are most definitely the first 7 Caesars: Julius, Augustus, Tiberius, Gaius, Claudius, Nero, and Galba. One of the heads took a fatal wound to itself, which, if anyone again studies the history of this, Nero committed suicide June 9th, 68 CE, and immediately after that became a time in Rome called the Year of the Four Emperors that was of mass chaos and destruction and war and civil wars. And the Roman historians themselves said that they didn't think that that Rome was going to recover, that it was gone. They were surprised. It was only after Vespasian ended up taking his throne officially that we actually have a quote directly in Josephus that everything turned around and started going towards prosperity again. So that beast's fatal wound, that beast that had 7 heads of those emperors, was healed and brought back to life because of that event in history. Now, what are the 10 horns? Believe it or not, and obviously some of this beast ties into the beast that's also in chapter 17, because it's described the same type of beast with 7 heads and 10 horns. At this time in Rome, there were 10 praetorial provinces that were, essentially independently owned or ruled over, but they were kings in a sense of those areas, yet they weren't the emperor. And just like Revelation 17 says, they lent their power to the beast for 1 hour to destroy, right? Well, these praetorial provinces were still under the governance of the empire and under the emperor, so that when they would go to war, or when he would go to war, so would they. So 7 heads, 10 horns of this beast obviously identifies as a whole the Roman Empire and the everything that goes along with it. Specifically dealing with Nero, John gives a really amazing way to describe how these people in Asia and the people he's writing this letter to are to actually identify who this person is. He gives them this sign of the number of the beast. And most people look at it and they think, oh, it's going to be a chip in your right hand, or something they inject into your forehead, or you got to get a stamp on your hand, 666, or something like that. But they're not looking through the symbols into what is intended, which in this case, John's message is: take out your pouches where you carry your money, take out a coin and look at it. The face on that coin and the number or the name on that coin, if you convert that name into a number, you convert that name into a number in our language, it's going to equate to a particular individual, and only that particular individual. And of course that equates to Nero Kaiser. And I have a picture in the book here of a 1st century coin. And I don't know how easy that's to see, but on that it says Nero Kaiser Augustus Imperator, which means, Nero Kaiser. Augustus, of course, was the surname for most of the emperors at that point, and then Imperator was emperor. There's a passage in Scripture in the book of Luke the book of Matthew, where the Jews are questioning him, saying, "Is it lawful to give tribute unto Caesar or not?" And Yeshua asks them, "Whose image is this?" And he's looking at the coin. "Whose image is this, and whose subscription on this?" So this teaching of this coin and using the coin as an identity for a Caesar had been taught to those believers in Yeshua before. So when they hear this, it has to do with buying and selling. They're going to think about money, and it has to do with something that's on that money that's going to identify this thing for them. All of that adds up together to them saying, I know what he's talking about. He's telling us to remember that teaching of Yeshua about who this is speaking of, who's on this coin, who am I supposed to give this to, and that identifies to them Nero Caesar, because that's who would have been on their coins at that day. So Nero is most definitely the first beast of chapter 13. The second beast is a little different in the fact that its description makes it much more ecclesiastical in nature and not so civil or imperial, because you can tell that the wildness of the first beast with its dragon-like description and its 7 heads and 10 horns is a very wild and wicked beast. Yet the second one is described in a much softer tone, with looking like a lamb with 2 horns, and there's many details that go into this, but in a sense, this second beast is the false and apostate religious system of the Jews this time, that especially consisted and were manifested through false messiahs and false prophets. The false messiahs and the false prophets, of course, being the 2 horns. The appearance of this beast was one that was supposed to seduce one into believing and following it because it was appealing, which is exactly what the Pharisees and the Sadducees wanted to convey themselves as. And yet, in that time, we know that there was a great anti-messianic spirit that had arisen. False prophets were spawning left and right, even all the way up till the time that the temple itself was literally burning in flames. There were people in the temple, false prophets, saying, our Savior is going to come and rescue us right now. So that's my understanding of the identity of those 2 beasts. Both of them in the end have still a spiritual being behind them, because we can't deny that obviously there are the forces in the heavenlies that govern the forces of the earthly. But in the end, the descriptions here are not intended to be something that mask the identity of these beasts. It's something that it's given in a certain way that only the people that would have understood the teachings of Yeshua and the prophets would actually be able to identify who these people are. If this correspondence of John were to have been intercepted by some Roman garrison on the way to Asia, and they opened this letter up and read it, they would be like, "What is this gibberish?" and toss it in the fire, and they wouldn't know anything about it. It was actually a brilliant thing.
Absolutely. I also see the second beast as being Titus and Vespasian, with the 2 horns and their strategy of coming against Israel in a pincer movement and a few other things. Those were a couple of very religious fellows, as a matter of fact, but their religion was in accordance with that of Rome. It would certainly be an apostate religion. So let's go on to the next symbol, the whore of Babylon. Now, we look at it for a while and we think, well, this is Rome. We look at Babylon for a while and we think, this is Jerusalem. Can it be both, or is it each, or is it something else?
Well, so the second beast is also called the false prophet. So in certain other places in the book, so it has to be linked to that in some way. So yeah. That's where it ties in to me, the false prophets and the false messiahs being the 2 horns of the main religious system. And these 2 things are working together in complete accord with one another to the absolute desolation of the people.
Consider Josephus' prophecy to Vespasian and Titus in regards to ruling the world. That's just it's speculation, but we're getting it down. We're getting it down now to the very base account. Go ahead with
So Babylon, most interpret, and we just had a little discussion about this in the group as well, because obviously I'm one of the few, if not the only, that really holds to the view this particular view as strongly as I do. Believe, and this is not uncommon for both the people on the Hebraic side of the faith and even on the Christian, is that Babylon prophesied, or is a prophecy of a coming revived Roman Empire or of the papacy itself. And they use the colors of the Babylon's clothing and her attire and being symbolic of what the Pope wears at certain occasions and stuff like that. But again, you're pulling this particular identity of this creature, this character in this great apocalypse, away from the culture completely and away from the entirety of what the purpose of the scriptures are as a whole. The scriptures, although they detail in certain areas with the destruction of peoples and kingdoms that would come against Israel, because that's the inevitable judgment of people that would stand against the people of Yahweh, is that they're going to eat their own, basically. In the end, the scriptures are as a whole devoted to and concerned with the people of Yahweh, which is Israel. So why is there such a demand for this to be? Because people haven't, read the rest of the scriptures. So, there's several pieces of identity that go into finding out who this is. First of all, Babylon's identified as a great harlot that sits upon many waters. And a big question that many people have is, well, Jerusalem doesn't sit upon many waters. How can that possibly be it? Well, believe it or not, there's several different quotes within Josephus's writings that says that her influence. Here's one of them. I'll give it to you. And from King David, who was the first of the Jews who reigned therein, to its destruction under Titus were 1,179 years, but from its first building to the last destruction were 2,177 years. Yet has not its great antiquity, nor its vast riches, here, pay attention here, nor the diffusion of its nation over all the habitable earth, and so on and so forth. Another quote, he says, "For as the Jewish nation is widely dispersed over all the inhabitable earth among its inhabitants." It surely didn't seem like Josephus's idea that Jerusalem didn't have influence across the world. Then, to understand the harlot portion, and again, we got to remember here that John is trying to communicate this message to people in a way that its recipients would understand what's being talked about in their day. Otherwise, this letter to them means absolutely nothing. Its relevance to them, its purpose to them to even read it or have it read to them or whatever is completely pointless if this has no application to them in their contemporary time. Isaiah and Jeremiah over and over again reference and refer to apostate Israel as a harlot several times in their prophecies, in their books, over and over again. You've committed adulteries, you're a whore, you're lovers, you're a harlot, you've played the harlot over and over again. And then even Yeshua, when speaking to the Jews, he calls them an evil and what? Everyone can say it, adulterous generation, right? We always skip over very simple things like that. So it is not beyond the scope of reality, and it's more within the scope of Scripture to believe that this harlot here is apostate Israel who had become so adulterated in its beliefs. Josephus describes it one way by saying that that generation was so atheistical, meaning that it had abandoned the true worship of Elohim at that point to such a degree that it wasn't even considered that the true faith. They had played harlots with wealth and with Rome and with any number of other Elohim that were not him. The woman being adorned, and of course riding the beast, we went over the beast. The adornment of the woman, very interesting. The descriptions of the colors there are often, again, related to the papacy and what the Pope would wear on certain occasions with purple and flowing. But they never stopped to think that, guess what? The same colors were worn by the high priests.
Exactly.
So, again, John is, we always have to remember as you're reading through the Apocalypse, he's trying to communicate this message to them in a clandestine way to identify people without identifying them to the wrong people. So when the people, the Hebrews that were reading this, would have read these colors, their first instinct wouldn't have been to think about a pope, because the pope didn't exist. Their first instinct would have been to think, what are these colors familiar to us in representation of this? And then the description that he gives about this woman being drunk in the blood of the saints and the prophets, and you have the teachings of Yeshua that say all of the prophets from Abel till Zechariah the son of Berechiah will come upon this generation. All this stuff, these people are going to be able to link these where we are completely ignorant of this and have to do all the study in history now. Those people already familiar with the Hebrew faith, already familiar with the scriptures, already familiar with the prophecies, and so intimately acquainted with this, would have heard this symbol and realized he's talking about apostate Israel and its priesthood that was purchased and put in place by the Romans, not by Elohim. Let's see, what else do we have? Another important part that people often skip over is this eighth king. What is this eighth king? We know what the seven kings are already, right? The seven heads are seven mountains. Seven mountains are also seven kings. Obviously, this is also, even back in the ancient Roman historians, they talk about the seven hills that Rome was built on. Pretty easy description to identify Rome at that point. But what about these kings? Seven kings, pretty easy to identify again, the first seven emperors of Rome. But it says that this eighth king is like them, comes from them, but is yet different. And in order to understand that, you have to actually go way back into Daniel chapter 7 in his prophecy, where he talks about there being 10 horns, and then a little horn comes up, and 3 kings are humbled before him. So let me ask you this. 10 plus 1 little one minus 3 is 8. So these people all have these prophecies again in their mind. They've heard Daniel since they were a child, read to them, right, in the synagogues. Their parents tell them about these stories. You're all familiar with them. This king, this little horn that rose up and spoke blasphemous things against the Most High and so forth, which all the quotes are in here from the historians about the books and about where this happened and when this happened. But this little horn was Titus that arose, and he is of the 7 because he's also a Roman emperor, but he's the 8th also because the 3 kings that came before, Galba, Otho, and Vitellius, were humbled before him before he became a co-emperor, which he was actually declared imperator at the same time that his father was. So he was unique from amongst all of them.
Here's another interpretation while you're at it.
Yep.
I see them the year of the 4 emperors. I don't see an exact time when each of them became. They just kind of fluffed into each other. They were all killed or committed suicide. I'm thinking that he skipped them altogether, and the one that was to stay a little time was Titus. He was only there a year and a half. And then Domitian as the 8th, because he belonged to the 7th, because it was his brother, and he goes to perdition. And an interesting thing about that, if you have a mind of wisdom, well, one of the little mathematical tricks that they used in the first century was factorializing numbers. That would be you take all the numbers from 1 to 8, add them together, then add them with all the numbers from 1 to whatever that added up to. And if you do that, you get 666. So the commentators of the early time always connected Domitian as the second coming of Nero because of his attempts to stamp out the faith entirely. So I think I can't wait to get this book. I'm going to write a commentary on your commentary. I cannot wait to get this book. I'm thinking of selling one of my gold teeth or something to get it right now.
Well, it's a good thing that it's not going to be priced that high. So
no, it's excellent price. How many pages? 500?
520.
Okay. Well, I gave you a link where you can order it on one of the places you can order it. He's given me permission to sell it for him. How about, let's go back to another controversial passage, very controversial, very contemporaneous, and that's chapter 7, where we have the 144,000 and we have the great multitude. So many people today either think they're in the 144,000 or, well, they believe that that is a literal number on the earth and that these people will go off in a rapture. Actually, they do in Revelation about chapter 6. But how do you interpret the 144,000 and the great multitude?
Right. So obviously we have to recognize the use of numbers, specific numbers throughout the apocalypse in order to fully understand this. It's very clear, and everyone that's ever read it knows that the number 7 is obviously very prolific. Also is the number 12. Also are any multiples of the number 12, such as 144, and also is the number 1,000 or multiples thereof as well. Some of the translations, unfortunately, mask a lot of this by using modern measurements such as miles. Like it'll say the New Jerusalem is 1,600 miles by 1,600 miles and so forth, but it actually says 12,000 stadia. Again, 12,000. Very important to understand that these numbers are illustrations that John is using, not necessarily things that are intended to be interpreted literally. Now, there's no way I can possibly say or speculate as to whether there were exactly 144,000 people that were being referred to in his day, but that's not, I think by even trying to speculate that, you're going way beyond what his intent was by giving that particular number. Now, to realize that the identity of these people and what, more importantly, is not being identified is to understand, obviously, the prophetic use, the apocalyptic use of the number 1,000. So in several different instances in Scripture, we know that the number 1,000 is used for something that's really meaning an indefinite number, something that's not intended to have a direct amount put on it. I'll give you a couple of examples. Deuteronomy 1:11 says, Yahweh, the Elohim of your fathers, make you 1,000 times as many as you are and bless you as he has promised you. Now, that's not Moses giving a blessing and saying, oh, your limit is 1,000 times. That's as much as you can be blessed. No. He's just saying, he's giving you a number that says 1,000 times. Another example, Psalms 50, verse 10. For every beast of the forest is mine, and the cattle upon 1,000 hills. Well, clearly, the cattle on the 1,001st hill is also his, right? These are all illustrations of numbers that are not intended to pin down to a specific number, but to say an indefinite multitude. Now, John, in his whole thing, he hears, this is an important distinction that you'll see over and over again in the Apocalypse, he hears the number 144,000. But when he turns and sees, there's a difference between his hearing and what he sees. He sees a great multitude that no man can number. So, I
never thought of it that way.
Yeah. So he's hearing 144,000, and the numbers he's giving you. There's always this part that came up in my mind. Why are the tribes different here? The tribe of Judah is listed first. It's never listed first in any count. There's two tribes that are missing altogether, Dan and Ephraim. And then there's a tribe, Levi is added, and he's never included in any tribal count because of his lack of inclusion in land and ownership and inheritance. Why do these exist? Give me just a second, guys. I got to go get my power cord. Stay there. Hold on.
If Lee were here right now, I'd have him sing the Dominique for you. But he's not here. Isn't this guy great? I'd like to get him on board.
Yes,
Other subjects.
Great stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, plugging it in. Sorry about that, everyone. Okay, so the tribal, I have a section here called the tribal mix-up, and it goes through those details. Why is the tribe of Dan excluded? Well, it's not because he was saying that there's not going to be any Danites that are going to be a part of the kingdom, or a part of the 144,000 for that matter. He's pointing, again, his audience back to the scriptures that they already understood. Dan is prophesied in his own father's prophecy toward him that he'll be a serpent in the way. Dan was the first one who dove headlong directly into idolatry, and it actually says in the book of Judges chapter 18 that they did not even leave idolatry all the way up until the Babylonian captivity. So that's John's way of saying not that there's not going to be any Danites in this group, this perfect number, this 12 times 12 times 1,000, perfect multiple, but there's not going to be any Danites in there. He's saying there's not going to be any idolaters. No idolater is going to be welcomed into the kingdom. And that's the same concept you see repeated throughout the scriptures. Same thing you see in the book or when it talks about the New Jerusalem, outside of the dogs and the sorcerers and the idolaters and so forth. Ephraim is the same thing. It says in the Psalms and in Hosea that they kept not the covenant of Elohim and refused to walk in his Torah. And it actually says that he chose not the tribe of Ephraim. And Ephraim is oppressed, crushed in judgment because he was content to walk after man's command and not Yahweh's. So he's not saying, again, that there's not going to be any Ephraimites in this crowd. He's saying that there's not going to be any covenant breakers in this crowd. And of course, then the inclusion of Levi and the exchange of Ephraim with Joseph is telling the people that in this crowd there will be priests as a part of this. And the inclusion of Joseph says that those who live a humble walk that are like Yeshua, submitting themselves humbly in love to the master and to their father, will be those who are able to be a part of this. Then when he turns and sees, he sees this great vast multitude that he sees are the actual number of the people that he can't describe that are going to be a part of this eternal kingdom.
Wow, so you're equating one with the other.
Correct.
That's cool. Usually what I hear is this is righteous Israel, just a few people, and the other is a Gentile church.
Yeah, the problem with that is that there is no Gentile church. I mean, realistically speaking, although we know that people are Gentiles, like myself, at least as far as I know. I don't know my genealogy back to whenever, but although we know that people are Gentiles, as soon as you unite yourself to Israel through Yeshua, you are considered part of Zion. You're considered part of Israel. So you're going to enter in through one of the 12 gates with one of those names on it. That's just the reality of it. So
how about can you give us a direct reference or close to the direct reference to something in Revelation that you find in Josephus' War?
How many do you want?
I know. That's what I say. Maybe you can open the book and find one.
Okay.
I have people that
sure.
say I can't interpret that way because Josephus is not inspired scripture.
I have people that say that they can't trust Josephus.
In the 19th century, Bibles, before the dispensationalists came in, Bibles were published with Revelation in the back of the Bible as a reference to Revelation. Josephus' War was published published right with Revelation as a reference. Did that give you enough time to find something?
I'm flipping through. Give me a second. I'm trying to give you the most meat that I possibly can. So that talks about Pella. Sorry, I'm having to turn.
I think that's Revelation 12.
Yeah, Revelation 12 has a bunch. It goes all through that's where I go through the maps and trace the actual the path of Vespasian. So here, let me give you some of this. I'll give you this. This is Revelation 12 is probably the best place to go. So in the very first description, we talks about the dragon, and most people think, especially tomorrow. Apparently tomorrow's the apocalypse, September 23rd.
That's why we're doing this today.
Yeah, happy apocalypse,
because
everyone.
There might not be a world.
Yeah, that's right. We might as well do it now while we still have it. So Revelation 12 at the beginning talks about the sign with the woman has 12 stars over her head, the moon under her feet. She's arrayed with the sun. They're going through all this crazy madness right now to think that that's actually speaking of some celestial occurrence, whereas this occurrence actually happens once every 300 years, 400. You can look at this at an app called Stellarium. It's an open source app, and you can find this alignment that happened. It's not super uncommon, so that which either means that the world ended 5 times in this last millennia or something else. But that sign is yet again another sign. It means something else. The woman, long story, not have to go into the details of it, represents true Zion. And the dragon in this instance is spoken of as having swept a third of the stars out with its tail. Well, okay, if we know that the stars historically, again, people that are listening to this message or reading it are Hebrews relating what they know. The 12 stars with the moon and the sun, the last time you see that is in Joseph's dream, where the 12 stars represent the 12 tribes of Israel. So the most logical conclusion here would be that somehow this dragon swept clean 4 of the 12 tribes of Israel, 1/3, right? Well, believe it or not, Israel was divided into 3 sections at that time: Galilee at the north, Samaria in the middle, and Judea in the south. Vespasian's Galilean campaign absolutely decimated Galilee, and 4 tribes dwelled in Galilee. And at the end of all of that, when Vespasian started pointing his face and his military host directly towards Judea and Jerusalem, truly in the tail of the dragon, 4 stars were swept out of the sky. 4 of those tribes were basically obliterated from the earth. And what's more, at the end of this, you're playing right now into the 7 angels' trumpet judgments. When you read through those from a historical reference perspective, do that, because that's really good into the chapters 8 and 9. The first angel's trumpet blown talks about hail falling from heaven, and 1/3 of the trees being burned up and 1/3 of the grass and so forth. Again, apocalyptic terminology. This is referring to different peoples of societal statures within that place that is going. And it's only, guess what, a 3rd judgment. 3rd. That's because only 1/3 of all of Israel is being affected by this, and that's Galilee. Long story short, you go through all of those. You go through the bloody plague in the 2nd trumpet, and you read about the slaughter of that Josephus mentions at the lake of Gennesareth, where they wage war to come and sack a city called Gennesareth, which is essentially right next to the Sea of Galilee. And the people flee from the city to try to get away from the Romans. They get onto their little tiny pirate ships on the Sea of Galilee, and lo and behold, Vespasian rolls up with his huge ships, and every single person that they could possibly see is absolutely slaughtered. If they try to climb onto the boats of the Romans, they get them up there, they cut their hands or their heads off, they stab them with spears off the end. And Josephus tells us that the water was bloody a long way, and that every place you could see was just nothing but blood. Now, later you actually read that the bodies from that slaughter traveled from the Sea of Galilee in the north all the way down the Jordan River to such a degree that at one point it was unpassable because of the amount of bodies that were stacked up in the Jordan River. So you relate these plagues directly to the historical record. At the very end of chapter 9, after it describes the fullness of the 6th angel's trumpet, it actually says that these people, after all of these things, did not yet repent of their sorceries and their idolatries and so forth. Guess what? Historians actually tell us that the reason Vespasian went through a 3rd instead of going directly to Jerusalem was to give them an opportunity for repentance. Titus actually tells them that. And he said, but you took our hand, basically, and our offering of peace for weakness. So,
yeah. The time is 55. I want to open it up for questions from anybody here.
Yep.
Fire away.
Hello, Adam.
Hello.
I have 2 questions.
Okay.
One, let's start with the area where you were talking about the hills in the mountains, the prophecy there, and it talked about Rome being built on hills. 7 hills. 7 hills.
Yeah.
And then you see somewhere else where it talks about mountains. Now, is there a linguistics or a translation error there? Because as I look at it, there's a difference between mountains and hills, correct?
In certain instances, I'd say, yeah. From a linguistics perspective, I don't know if John's intent in that particular instance was to convey the difference between a hill and a mountain. Believe it or not, there actually is a place where he intends to convey that difference in chapter 16. But in the instance that Rome was built on 7 hills versus 7 mountains, I guess it would just, one's interpretation of what a hill is versus a mountain per se. But the only contemporary description of a city that can be described as the seven kings that are also seven mountains, and all these, again, imagery of a particular thing is to describe the image of that beast. And so you kind of got to piece together the preponderance of the evidence to see what it lines up with.
Okay. Let me ask you this question as well. Now, in the book, it looks like you made a very substantial case here for these events happening already in Israel, in a particular place. Now, do you believe that there is a possibility that some, if not all, not all of them, but some of this stuff can happen again?
That's a great question, and honestly, that's one of the first ones that people come up with when they start seeing various aspects of this being true, including myself, because I think it's hard for most of us, and again, myself included, to believe that the stuff that we've been told is still yet future is all past. And so our brains aren't prepared to jump that far right away. So we start looking into the dual fulfillment concept, which honestly, the more that I've looked at prophecy as a result of this understanding, the less I've actually seen dual fulfillment as being something that's in the scriptures. Now that sounds odd, but the question really lies in, do we as believers, have we created the concept of a dual interpretation because we are unwilling or undesiringly wanting to accept a fulfillment of the things that we've held so true to as being future?
Let's see.
Such as the resurrection of the dead, for instance, and so forth. What I go through in the book, though, is to describe that even though these things, I believe, are taking place in the past, there doesn't need to be a fear of eternal life being jeopardized or something like that. That all of it's mistaken, and we need to rehash and look at all of it.
As you said to me a few years ago, unless you dot every I and cross every T.
Yep.
Now, that means that if it's in the future, all this stuff is going to happen within 7 years. All of it. Well, I don't think that that's possible to have a dual interpretation. It's my opinion, though, but I think that it's primarily, again, as Adam said, because people are not studying this out for themselves. They enjoy the prophecy teachers of today, and most of them come from dispensationalist religious organizations that have to keep that myth going in order to keep their own business going. There's so many that teachers that I knew better about this, but they simply won't go to a reasonable interpretation such as Adam's. They still continue to hold on to this 7-year future thing. I recall Jack Van Impe, for instance, some years ago when I was writing a book on this subject. Wouldn't dare release it now. But he, for instance, was supposed to be the prophecy master of that time, and he knew 10,000 verses in the Bible and all. And the European Union went to 13 members.
Yes.
It had to have 10 members. So I remember him, for instance, change his story, saying it goes to 13, but it comes back to 10.
Yes, I actually remember that.
Yes,
I remember that.
They all did that kind of thing. And yes, as long as you change that every once in a while, but the very possibility of all those things happening in a symbolic sense or a literal sense in the 7 years of future is, to me, ludicrous.
Well, the reason I specify, there's a section in the introduction specifically addressing futurism in general.
Yeah.
And what I say in there is that futurism is, in a sense, as strange as it sounds, it's the perfect method of belief because it's simultaneously, undeniable and indefensible. So no one can deny that it's true because it hasn't happened, but yet the people that believe it or hold to it can't possibly defend it because they have no proof or foundation upon which to stand. And you just gave a perfect example of how a futurist's belief has to continue to change and morph over time in order to keep the story going.
One more question, for you. Let's say everything has happened concerning Jerusalem and the Middle East, and everything has happened concerning the day of Yahweh. Now, let's look forward. How do you see this all wrapping up?
Okay, so I want to clarify one thing very carefully here. There are about 5 verses in the book of Revelation that I don't think have a fulfillment. And those are in Revelation chapter 20, when it's talking about Satan's release and the battle of Gog and Magog. I do not believe that has transpired at this point. I believe that is still to come. So if I were to declare some sort of a, quote, end of all things, it would be that battle, which the only illustration you have in the Old Testament prophets of a battle against from Gog and Magog is in Ezekiel chapters 38 and 39. And again, it's a parallel to what John describes as the battle that takes place between Satan and the beloved city at the end, where in the long story short, it's a battle waged from people brought from every corner of the world against Israel. Israel doesn't lift a finger themselves to fight. Their Elohim comes and fights for them, destroys all the wicked, and Israel spoils and plunders their enemy in the end. And so that's exactly what we see in Revelation 20. So I do not believe that has yet happened. As soon as that happens and Satan is then permanently destroyed forever at that point, then I would say that would be the final wrapping up of the show. However, we're not provided with any timeline, at least that I see, of that happening.
Anybody else with questions?
I saw Allison post something in a chat. Let's see. If today we are on a parallel track as the days of the apostles, does that mean we're not going to go through a horrific tribulation? Gotcha. Okay, so that's a really great question, actually. I believe that first of all, there's a passage in the Bible. There's only one passage in Scripture that actually uses the phrase "the Great Tribulation," and it's in the book of Revelation. Anything else that you find doesn't have the definite article in it. It's not like that. So I believe the Great Tribulation that John was referring to was in their day, and it was called the Neronic persecution. It took place between 64 CE and then Nero's suicide in June of 68. During that time, he would take Christians, they call it Christians, of course, in the historians' writings, but I would say these were the early Hebrew believers in the faith. They would take them, they would tie them up to stakes, and they would pour oil over them, and they would light them on fire to line the streets of Rome at night. They would dress them up in the skins of animals, and then let wild beasts go and tear them apart. Now, am I going to say that there's not going to be horrific persecution for you, for instance, or even maybe for me in the future, that I'm going to undergo that for my faith? No, I'm not going to say that. However, Hebrews 2 tells us that the one who died brought to naught the one who had the power of death, so that those who lived in fear of death no longer live in fear of death. So, if we end up having a horrific tribulation, it wouldn't be anything unlike other generations have since then and before us have seen. The Spanish Inquisitions, other people have seen tribulations like that in the past. I don't know if that answers your question.
Excellent. Jason Capone, he's got a question, and then we'll wrap it up. Would you say that the Pesher technique was employed at all in the composition of Revelation?
You'll have to clarify the Pesher technique for me.
The Pesher technique is to take an Old Testament prophecy and make it primarily be happening while you're alive. I guess like people taking Revelation today and saying, well, this wormwood came to pass in 1986 with Chernobyl. Okay. I think that's what he means.
Well, I think that as a whole, if I were to sum up the book of Revelation in a conglomerate, I would say It is John's description of showing that all of the curses and the plagues and the punishments that were promised to come against Israel because of its disobedience were at that time being wrought and brought against them. You'll see many parallels in the book in comparisons that I bring to Deuteronomy chapter 8 and the curses for disobedience that are in there. John is referencing them exactly. He's taking the plagues of Egypt and making them wondrous upon them, which is why when you see the descriptions of the trumpet judgments and the bowl judgments, you read about blood in the waters and hail falling from heaven and 3 frogs come out of the mouth and all these illustrations and these characters being drawn from these things, because John is trying to tell them all these plagues that were promised to come upon you are being brought upon them. Look, people, here is wisdom. Open up your eyes. Guess what? That punishment that's been talked about, all that disobedience, when Leviticus chapter 25, I think, talks about if you do this and this and this, I'll bring upon you 7-fold your times of thing. Look at the number 7, how it's prolific throughout the apocalypse. It's, the overall message is that epoch of time has finally come, has been fulfilled, where the cup of Yahweh's wrath has been so filled that it's time to bring the true kingdom in and to bring upon all the curses and the pains and the judgments that were promised throughout the generations. So I don't know if that lines up with the Pesher thing, but I think that the prophets, many of them pointed towards that particular junction in time. And honestly, outside of the timing of the crucifixion itself, it would almost be more significant to have the turning of time take place in that era, 70 CE, than it would at 0 and 1 AD, if that makes any sense, because of how epic it was.
Thank you very much, Adam. It's been a great interview.
Do you want me to answer this one last question from?
Is there one? Well, sure.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to try not to spoil the rest of the book for you here, Liz. So if I'm brief on this, excuse my brevity. Yes, there is a millennial reign, but the question is, actually, let me rephrase that. No, there's not a millennial reign, because the word millennium doesn't exist in the book of Revelation, despite what people have decided to insert it there. It's a very important distinction, although it seems trivial at first. It actually is an important distinction. The scriptures actually say that there's a 1,000-year reign, not a millennial reign. Millennial puts it in people's minds today, puts in our mind a fixed period of time, 1,000 years. Whereas the term 1,000 years, when used apocalyptically, and the other scriptures already referenced, is a indefinite period of time. Could be 5,000 years, could be whatever. It's indefinite. It's not intended to be defined and limited by a specific period of time. So when you read the descriptions of the kingdom of heaven and the kingdom of Elohim as described by John the Baptist, by Yeshua, he says, my kingdom is not of this world. Flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom. He is a king. We see him sitting on a throne in visions and stuff like that. It says that we are seated in heavenly places with him through, we died, we were raised with him. All these things spoken of in the past tense. And you look in the prophecies of Daniel chapter 2, and the little small stone came down and crushed the entire statue, and that happened in the days of those kings. And that stone became growing and growing and growing ever so slowly to becoming a great mountain. The kingdom is here. It's in a place where we can't see it with our physical eyes, because it was never intended to be something we were seeing with our physical eyes. So if you believe that you are a believer, if you follow Yeshua, you have a role already in the kingdom. You have a task that you're supposed to accomplish and a mission set before you by your king. And it's not to look towards the stars to see a cube city coming down out of heaven. It's to work a mission on this earth, to look around you here where it is and to see what he has for you here. And the kingdom, I'll go in, all this is in the book, but the resurrection of the dead has no necessity for people like you and I right now. It had a prophecy and it had a fulfillment at that time, and it needed to be fulfilled. But right now, I'll give you a teaser with Revelation 14:13, where it says, "Blessed are those who die in the Master from henceforth, for they shall rest from their labors." Here's the question to get you thinking. Why is the people's death after that time so much more blessed than those before? I'll leave it at that.
Very appropriate for an ending. And I thank you again. I thank you folks for coming out. I'll try to convince this fellow maybe to do this again soon. But you can get his book either at the link I gave you, or there are several other places, Create Space, and I think it's coming on Amazon too.
Yeah, give me a little bit of time too, because going through the print proof just to make sure there's no other mistakes or errors I need to fix or whatever. So if there's any delays in shipment or anything like that, just excuse that. It's me, not Amazon. It's my perfectionism.
Thank you again.
Yep.
And we'll see you soon. See you at the bookstore.